So in the New Testament, there are 4 books that we call Gospels. They are ordered Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What's interesting is that the first Gospel written is Mark. Mark is the shortest of the 4, and Matthew and Luke seem to be familiar with the story that Mark was telling, and John is a completely different kettle of fish altogether, kind of a mystical look at who Jesus is. What we see in the 4 Gospels is that each Gospel writer has a different agenda. Not a bad thing to have an agenda. A different agenda and a different message about Jesus that they want to convey to anybody who might be hearing that story or later reading it. For example, there is no birth story in the Gospel of Mark. It begins with Jesus as a 30-year-old man being baptized by John in Jordan River. Matthew and Luke both have birth stories, but they are different one from another. Matthew has some characteristics that we'll look at in just a minute that are unique and important to the message that he wants to share with folks who are going to be hearing his gospel, and Luke the same. Both birth stories, but very, very different. So when we go to the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, we see this. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. This is the only place in the Bible where we see this verse and where we see Jesus referred to as Emmanuel, God with us. Matthew apparently wants to be sure that we hear from the get-go that Jesus is Emmanuel and that God is with us, was with us, is with us, will always be with us, and that's in the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and again, completely unique to Matthew. So he wants us to know that. Emmanuel, God with us. When we come to worship at Christmas time and we hear these words, Emmanuel, God with us, they warm our hearts. We like to hear them. We love to celebrate the birth of Jesus, and why not? Because Matthew tells us he is Emmanuel, God with us. Over and over and over again, we'll hear that in the Gospel of Matthew. Then we move forward to the story of the baptism of Jesus. You might know that Jesus went out into the Jordan River, and he was baptized by a man named John. And as he was in the water, as the story goes, suddenly the skies opened, and the Spirit descended in the form of a dove, and there was a voice. This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. This is the voice of God who is pleased with Jesus, who is God with us. So there is something of God in Jesus, which is why Matthew says from the very beginning, Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And God is well pleased with the manifestation of himself in Jesus. Baptism of Jesus foreshadows our own baptisms. Baptism of Jesus foreshadows our own identity as God's children, sons and daughters, with whom God is well pleased in the way that he is well pleased with Jesus. So there is something of God in us as well. God is with us, and we as God are with each other. Emmanuel, God with us. Who would not want to hear that? So we fast forward to chapter 17 of the Gospel of Matthew. Interestingly enough, this story appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when you see a story that appears in all 3 Gospels, probably ought to pay attention. It means it's really important, not that others aren't, but it means that all 3 Gospel writers thought it was important for their hearers and readers to learn about this story, the Transfiguration. There is this little phrase at the beginning, which could be a throwaway, or it could be more than that. So, after 6 days, what would come after 6 days? The 7th. How many days in the creation narrative in Genesis? 7. 7 is symbolic for completion, perfection. When something happens on the 7th day, we ought to pay attention to what's happening. So after 6 days, on the 7th day. Jesus is transfigured. He shines so brightly that the disciples can barely stand to look at him. It is as if the glory of God, which dwells within him, comes out and he is transformed. The Greek word for transfiguration or being transfigured is metamorphosis. Meta means to change, morphe means form. And so Jesus is suddenly brighter than the sun. They see in Jesus God's glory, God's brightness, and it overwhelms them, as indeed it should. How many of you are fearful of heights? By a show of hands. Yeah? A little higher? I know you want to put your hands too high. You might be afraid. I am acrophobic. Absolutely scared of heights. I'm okay with taking a ladder and putting it up to the low level of gutters, but not beyond that. When you see this guy on the edge, can you see him? If I had a floor that was 50 feet wide, I would still feel like I was there on the edge. You've been to Toronto? See the wonderful needle when you go up to the top and you can stand there and you know you're not going to fall. But if you're afraid of heights, you're going to be a little, right, Mark, a little reluctant to step out there. I wonder if because of what was happening, the disciples might have had a little bit of an acrophobic experience, that they were high and they were overwhelmed, and maybe it was something that absolutely made them afraid. They didn't even realize they were fearful of heights until suddenly they were there and there was God's glory revealed in Jesus, and it had to be overwhelming. Jesus shines brighter than the sun. They don't know what to make of it. They will eventually, but not in this case. So suddenly, in this story, Matthew tells us, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Familiar words? I know you might not have been paying attention in the middle of things, but were you paying attention at the beginning? Where does it come from? Help me. Thank you. Andrew's a seminary student. He better be able to answer that. If not, you shouldn't be paying your tuition. Yeah. Story of baptism. It's sort of like, okay, if you didn't catch it the first time, I'm going to come around again. This is my son, the beloved, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. God comes into the story again to say, Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. Listen to him. I'm well pleased. My son, listen to what Jesus has to say. Emmanuel, God with us. Love to hear it at Christmas time. Not sure the disciples were exactly sure what to make of it on the Mount of the Transfiguration, but God made it clear to them, as clear as God could. Altitude sickness. Ever experienced altitude sickness before? Yeah? What happens with altitude sickness? Bad headache. You get dehydrated. Your heart rate. You can't sleep. Yeah. So you're on this mountaintop. Maybe the disciples had a little episode of acrophobia because all of a sudden it's so high, it's so mighty. And altitude sickness, if you experience it for too long, it's just not a good thing. And so after all of this, they get to make their way down the side of the mountain. And they're able to come to a place of cantus firmus, the ground is firm. And now that they're on the ground, now that they've gotten away from their fear of heights, now that they're here, life should be better. Except that Jesus says that from here, he will be heading into Jerusalem and to the cross. And if he's headed to Jerusalem and the cross, chances are good that the disciples might be headed in the same direction. And so we come to a place in our lives where we feel like we are absolutely on solid ground. We've had this experience of God. Now we're on the ground. We came down the mountain, and all is going to be well. And then all of a sudden, boom, our life blows up. Our husband, who has been with us for 30 years, steps out on his wife. I've had a job for 20 years, and all of a sudden the employer says, don't have space for you. Somebody younger comes into the mix. You have a brother who is struggling with an addiction and doesn't quite know how to get over it, and you can't quite figure out how to help him. Boom, your life blows up. One of your children discovers that she has a rare form of cancer that's probably untreatable. Right now, know someone in that situation. Boom, your life is blown up. And you think because you were standing on solid ground, things are doing good, but it doesn't work out exactly the way that you hope it would. And life blows up in unpredictable ways much of the time. Life is not typically one straight line from one event to the next, but things do blow up and things do throw us off and things do make us wonder. So we carry this heavy burden and we wish that life would treat us more fairly. And so we wonder, does it really matter? Does our life really matter? Because we've had this experience which was amazing, and we've come down and it's just not working out the way that we thought it would. I want to talk to you this morning about what you might hear from some preachers about the struggles that you have. There's some preachers who will say to you and to me that if you just believe enough, all will be well. If you just believe the right things, you will have no more experiences of your life blowing up. If you just read the right literature, if you just act the right way, if you just, then all will be well. Problem with this kind of theology, the problem with this understanding of faith, is that when things don't go well for us the way that we hope they would, we can easily turn on ourselves. We can start to think, well, you know what? That preacher said that if I had enough faith, if I believed enough, if I read the right information, if I did all of the right stuff, that life would be good. And so we can turn it in on ourselves. The truth about life is that God has never promised that it will be easy. God has never promised that we will have no struggles. God has never promised that we will never be overwhelmed. God hasn't promised that life will always line up the way that we hope and think it should. God has never promised us that. But if we listen to those preachers who would say, well, if you've got that problem, then we find ourselves in a trap. But God doesn't promise that. What God promises is Emmanuel, to be with us. God promises to walk in Jesus with us. Because Emmanuel, God with us, fully human, and the divinity of God within him, understands what we live through, because as a fully human being, he does not escape the difficulties that come with life. And so when we say Emmanuel, God with us, it's wonderful to celebrate a baby on Christmas Eve. It's even more important to hang on to this truth that God in Jesus is with us and understands us and walks with us and never abandons us, even when things don't go well, because they're not going to go well, at least some of the time. But God promises to walk with us. So it's wonderful when you go from the manger, Emmanuel, God with us, to the cross, Emmanuel, God with us, and Jesus is in all of it. Born for us, dies for us, and then even better news, there is the empty tomb. Without the empty tomb, we of all people are to be pitied. Without the empty tomb, Jesus is a great teacher. Jesus is a great Friend, Jesus is a great leader. Without the empty tomb, we of all people are to be pitied. The empty tomb vindicates Jesus. The empty tomb is a sign that even death could not overcome Emmanuel, God with us. So every Sunday is a celebration of the resurrection. Every Sunday we remind ourselves that death could not, does not, and will not overcome Emmanuel because he will be with us. Life's going to be tough. Life's going to be good. Life's going to be all of it. But in the midst of it, we know and can trust Emmanuel, God with us, never alone, always for us. The tomb is empty. Resurrection life is today.